We are working through the Statement of Financial Position. We've already had presentations on assets. This organization has 31 million in assets up here on the top where the assets are. The claims against the assets are at the bottom. So the total assets and the total claims are the same amount. It makes sense. If there's anything in our assets that the creditors do not claim, we claim it. Nothing is left on the table, so to speak. That's why the two balances. We have 31 million in assets, the creditors claim 12 million, and that leaves 19 million in net assets. That 19 million is what this video is about. First off, the name net assets is a lousy name. It's standard nonprofit jargon. It's not some goofball church term. Rather, it is a standard nonprofit jargon for the part of the assets left over after you consider the liabilities. The GAAP people who make up these things did not want to call it stockholders' equity, and they did not want to call it capital or anything like that. They had to search for a name that did not show outside ownership like you see on business financial statements. They came up with the name net assets. You will be okay with the name if you're clear on the one big fact about net assets. The big fact is net assets are not assets at all. They are claims against the assets. The assets are up here in the 31 million. The creditors claim 12 million. That's left over the ownership claims of 19 million in the category of net assets. These net assets are claims that are left over after creditors have gotten their bit. We have 19 million in net assets. The church has created a little monster of complexity that we have to tackle. We do need to spend a little bit of time to sort things out. It is the most complicated thing in this entire video series, so just fasten your seatbelts. We can do it. We're putting labels on the net assets to help us be good stewards. What makes a good steward? And what is good stewardship? In Bible times, a steward took care of his master's money while he was away on a trip. A good steward does three basic things well. He takes care of his master's resources, spends them the way they are supposed to be spent, and finally he can show that he has done the first two things properly. They keep good records and make enough reports so that they can show that they were a good steward. When it comes to stewardship, it is not just doing right, but is being able to show you did right. That is what good stewardship is. And stewardship is the important point of our net assets section. Besides stewardship, we have planning issues and management issues. Planning issues and management issues and stewardship issues are all tangled up in the net assets section. We're going to slice and dice these net assets in every way conceivable to help us with this stewardship function. Up and down, sideways and crossways. Each of the way we divide things we will call dimensions. Each dimension is somewhat isolated from the others. The first dimension by which we're going to slice and dice the assets is between the two funds, the planned fund and the operating fund. We have 19 million in net assets. 5 million of them are in the planned fund and 14 million are in the operating fund. So let's look closer at the 5 million. The big fact about the 5 million is that it is not available for operations. You'll see that in a minute. The 5 million has two parts. It has the invested in plant function of nearly 4 million. So what does that mean? Notice that we have land building equipment of 4,975,856. Now that is in buildings. That's the value that we have paid for buildings and the appreciated value of what we paid for buildings and equipment and land. And it's just not available for operations. It's set aside over here by itself. Then if we subtract the mortgage on those land buildings and equipment of 1 million, we get the balance for invested in plant. So the $3,975,856 is the portion of net assets that are tied up in land, building, and equipment. So when we're planning and doing our stewardship, right away we know that we cannot budget that part of net assets. That net assets is basically unreachable as far as budgeting and planning for new operations. Next, we have $1,243,890 in unexpended plant funds. This is connected to the other assets in the plant fund. Mathematically, they are the plant fund investments of $1,245,890 minus the liability of $2,000. This money is real money and is earmarked for land, building, and equipment. So it can be budgeted, but only for that. There are two ways that it gets in this pot. Either the donors restricted the donation or the board has allocated it to that pot. Sometimes the board allocates it generally, like just set aside this money for land, building, and equipment, and sometimes it does it specifically, set aside this money to build a new conference office. So we cannot just, as far as budgeting is concerned, we can budget this, or we have to budget this, but we need to do it recognizing that this money is destined or earmarked for that purpose. So you can see how net assets are helping us by tagging these net assets. They help us with our stewardship role of making sure things are being spent the way they're supposed to be spent. So let's take this at a run. We have a total of $31 million in assets. We're going to use up $12 million for our debts. That leaves us net assets of $19 million. Of the $19 million, nearly $4 million is tied up in land, building, and equipment. So that amount of the $19 million is fairly permanently tied up. Another $1,243,000 of the $19 million is available, but only for land, building, and equipment. This leaves $14 million remainder for operations. So $19 million total, made up of $5 million that is tied up in land, building, equipment, and $14 million in operations. The plant fund net assets plus the operating fund net assets equals the total $19 million of net assets. These operating net assets can be sliced and diced in several ways. The next dimension we're going to look at is tithe versus non-tithe. The $14 million is either tithe contributions that we have not spent and still have, or it is non-tithe contributions that we have not spent. Well, what about these tithe funds? Bible study, Ellen White teachings, and church policy committees have all decided that tithes can only be spent in a certain way. We'll have another video on that. A faithful member gives us $1,000 or $1,000 in tithe donations, and we spent $800 in the way it was supposed to spend. We have $200 of tithes still on hand to make sure that we need to make sure that we use it properly. To help us with stewardship, we keep it separate from non-tithe money. That way we can make sure we spend it the way it's supposed to be spent. Non-tithe money can be spent on any moral or legal way the board wants to use it to fulfill the organization's mission. The tithe money has to be spent in the way that the church stipulates. The money itself is up at the top in the asset section, but we keep track of where it is headed, in this case to tithe purposes or not tithe, by labeling net assets as either tithe or non-tithe. We're not out trying to get too deep in theology here, but it will help us if I say that this tithe money is designated by God as tithe money. The idea is only suggested here to help us with the upcoming topics, and there's no need for you to think too deep about it or so forth, but it's useful to think that God designates money as tithe money, and we as a board or as a denomination cannot make it tithe money into non-tithe. Notice again, all the $14 million is either tithe or it is not. If you're curious about what tithe is and how it can be spent, we have an upcoming video on that, and you want to make sure that you watch it. So again, the $14 million is either tithe or it is not. There's another way to look at the $14 million. For emphasis, I want to make sure you are clear. We're dividing up the same $14 million that was either tithe or non-tithe and looking at it from a different perspective. In the same way that you might have 2 daughters and 3 sons, and also you may have 3 blonde-haired children and 2 dark-haired children, and they're all mixed up in that. And so that's sort of the same sort of concept, a different way of looking at the same thing. This new concept is the same, whether it is tithe versus non-tithe, but now the distinction is whether it is restricted or unrestricted. If a donor has given you money for evangelism among the Igbo of Southeast Nigeria and we haven't spent it yet, it is a restricted net assets. It is put in a separate pot to make sure it gets spent in the right purpose. We use the word restriction to mean donor restricted. A main point here is that if donors have restricted the donation to a specific purpose, it's not available for other purposes. Also, only donors can change their restriction. The $14 million is either restricted or it is not. So the $14 million is either tithe or it is not, and is set aside or earmarked by God as tithe. And the $14 million is either restricted or not, and that is the restricted is that earmarked by donors. We have one last category, allocated net assets. This is the same as the others, except for the designation comes only from the board. They specify that some net assets should be set aside for a specific purpose. Let's say for the evangelism of the Igbo of Southeast Nigeria. No one can change tithe into non-tithe, what God has declared holy, you know what I mean. Only the donor can restrict and unrestrict and change restriction. But allocated net assets are set up and removed by the board. So the same net assets can be either tithe or non-tithe, restricted or unrestricted, and allocated or unallocated. There is considerable interaction between the allocated dimension and the other. The board can designate tithe to the Igbo evangelism allocated net asset. That is because evangelism is an approved use of tithe. That is, it says we want to set aside this tithe and earmark it for evangelism among the Igbo. It can also designate non-tithe to the Igbo pot. It can take non-tithe money and say, we are going to put it aside in the Igbo pot for evangelism of the Igbo. The board can designate restricted donations to the Igbo allocated pot as long as it complies with the donor's restriction. The donor may have given it for evangelism, and the board can say, we want it to go in the Igbo pot. Don't let these examples confuse you. There are 3 dimensions: tithe, restriction, and allocation. They are 3 separate, almost unrelated ways of having stewardship over the same money. So the Igbo allocated net asset has tithe donations in it, non-tithe donations in it, restricted donations in it, and unrestricted donations in it. The finance department has to keep this all sorted. This does cause a little confusion. Suppose the financial statements have a figure, Igbo evangelism, 100,000. This is an allocated net asset. Igbo evangelism for 100,000. This does not mean that you can go crazy with the 100,000 and spend it any way you want as long as it's for the Igbo. It still has to consider the tithe and non-tithe characteristics of the money and the restricted and non-restricted characteristics of the money. So let's say you want to build a church Well, you cannot use tithe to build a church. So you'd have to make sure that you have enough non-tithe money in the IGBU allocated in order to build a church. And also make sure that your restriction, if the restriction was purely for evangelism and there was no room within the restriction to build a church, then you have to make sure you have enough unrestricted money to build a church. But you don't have to worry about it too much because the accountants and the auditors have to keep all this sorted. Your main task as a president or a board member is to understand the jargon and the rules. That an allocated has tithe and non-tithe in it. It has restricted and unrestricted in it. And you just have to navigate both of those characteristics within the allocated pot. So let's run through it again. This time, let's look at it as if the president just had a brainstorm of a good idea and he was looking for money for the project. This example ignores what I refer to as a liquidity problem, which I'll address that later on. To make it a good example, let's say his bright idea was to build a dining hall at the youth camp. This is a project that cannot use tithe money. So let's look at these financial statements and see if there's money to build a dining hall. And we're taking it slow, so don't rush to the end. So the organization has $31 million, but there's a burden of $12 million in liabilities. So that leaves for sure only $19 million that could be used on the dining hall. Of the $19 million, nearly $4 million is tied up in plant, property, and equipment. So we cannot spend it on the new dining hall. That part, that $4 million, and so that leaves $15 million. But of that $19 million, or of the $15 million, there's $1 million that is in plant investments. So we can't spend that on the new dining hall, but there may be some help here. It depends on whether the $1 million is restricted by donors or by the board to a specific building project, or if it's just to be used on building, and you could say, maybe we could build the new dining hall out of that $1 million. But let's say we couldn't for some reason, and so let's keep looking. So taking this at a run again, we have $31 million in assets, $12 million is going to liabilities, that leaves us $19 million. Of the $19 million, $4 million is tied up in plant, property, equipment, and $1 million is tied up in building funds that are attached to a specific building. So I think I've got my math right here, and we have 19 minus 1 minus 4, and so that leaves us $14 million, I believe. So let's keep looking at the $14 million. Of that $14 million, at least $3 million is in tithe funds, and we can't use that because it can't be used to build a dining hall. So of the $14 million, $3 million is tithe funds, can't be used. That leaves us $11 million. Also of the $14 million, $7.7 million has been allocated. But not all hope is lost when we see it in allocated, because we can look down the list of allocated net assets. The list of allocated net assets are in the statement of net assets, and we look down the list and we can just try to see if there's some that could be used on the camp. For example, we may look down and see that there's a camp allocated net assets, and that the camp allocated is not tithe, it's not restricted, and we might be able to build a dining hall out of that allocated net assets. But if it's not there, we can continue looking. There's some other pots. There's this unallocated non-tithe. Now that is where the money could come from. Unallocated non-tithe. So unallocated non-tithe, it's non-restricted. It doesn't say it, but it would also be unrestricted. And there is the money for the dining hall for the camp. Let's look at another example just quick. What if we had a tithe great idea? That is, we wanted to put a chaplain in the high school, Adventist high school. That's a tithe use of funds. It's okay to use that use tithe money for that. And we go through the same process, but this time the tithe constraint would not be there. So when we looked at the allocateds, if we saw something for the school and it wasn't tied up because of restriction, then we could spend that money that was for the school for the new chaplain. But finally, we get down to tithe unallocated, and for sure that could be spent for the new chaplain. Well, I hope all this makes sense, and I hope you understand, or at least getting a handle on all the jargon from all of this conversation. I sure appreciate you listening to these videos and tolerating my mistakes and goofs when I'm trying to explain them. So thanks a lot and for your patience, and please continue to watch.